It worked now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Excellent. Everything went okay with your eye?
Look at the left eye.
Yeah. Yes. You want to connect to?
Bleeding from the eye.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You want to connect?
Yes.
So this is a 0. Okay. So, okay. Okay, I'm going to start class, and nobody's watching online yet, but what I do know is that when they do watch, they're 5 seconds behind us. So you can say something and then take it back. So, a what? No. I don't have that capability. So I want to welcome everyone. Who is here live in the chapel at Shaare Tefila, and anybody else who might eventually be watching online. Can we quickly go around the room to make sure everybody knows who everybody is? Marlene?
Yeah, Marlene Sandberg.
Barbara Schneider.
Deborah Decal.
Barbara? Say the name?
John Pfeffer.
John, okay.
Julian Liebman. David.
So welcome everybody. So the topic tonight is a topic that, the general topic, which I've done before, which I like to do, and that is to highlight recent decisions of the Law Committee of the Conservative Movement. So many of us here are familiar with what the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is. From now on, I'll call it CJLS for short. And but I just want to be sure that everybody knows. So that one of the foundational elements of conservative Judaism is the fact that we adhere ideologically to the system of Jewish law, but unlike Orthodox denominations, we, as a conservative movement, feel ideologically that the system of Jewish law is an ever-evolving process. So instead of looking to precedent and seeing what the Shulchan Aruch, the law code that was written and summarized by Rabbi Joseph Caro and Rabbi Moses Isserlis in the 1500s, rather than looking to that as a guide for Jewish practice today, the conservative movement looks to that as a source of precedent, but also what goes on in the world around us today is just as important as well. So, like I said, it's an ever evolving process. So the way it works in the conservative movement is that we have this law committee made up of experts, mostly rabbis, and there are 5 lay people as well who serve on the committee. And it used to be that when questions were posed to the law committee, and then they would agree to research them and answer them, invariably there would be a majority opinion and a minority opinion that would be published. And the either opinion could be followed by any individual rabbi in the conservative movement world, as long as the minority opinion had a requisite amount of votes. And at the time, that was 6 votes. So 6 votes would make it a minority opinion, And then, so therefore, the classic minority opinion that most conservative Jews follow is a decision from the 1950s that allows people to drive to synagogue on Shabbat. So that was the minority opinion. The majority opinion said no, that the tradition should be maintained that Jews should not drive to synagogue on Shabbat. But because the minority opinion had the requisite votes, it was adopted, and therefore many conservative Jews today drive to synagogue on Shabbat, if not elsewhere as well. Though that was not part of the decision. They just drive to synagogue and drive home. Now, the past few years, they dropped the terms majority and minority, and as long as it has votes, it's an opinion that is accepted. And it's up to rabbis then to, on their own, after reading the decisions, to decide which one they feel that they want to follow and that their synagogue should follow.
Does it say there were 18 in favor? 18 voted for this and 7 voted for this?
Right. So the question is, does the decision say who voted and how many votes there are? Yes. It does. And not only does it tell us how many votes the paper got, but who the people are who voted for, who voted against, and who abstained. Okay? And that, for those in the know, it might be helpful to know who the rabbis are that are voting for and who are voting against, because the rabbis tend to be consistent in their outlook to Jewish law, and there could be individual rabbis out there who prefer to follow the opinion. If let's say, Rabbi Daniel Nevins, who is the current dean of the rabbinical school, sits on a law committee, if he has a particular decision and he votes yay or nay, then some people will follow the opinion of Rabbi Nevins without bothering necessarily to read the opinion, because they trust Nevins. They like his approach. That's just an example. Or they like Elliot Dorff, or they like Joel Roth when he was on the committee years ago. So that's why the names are there, so that people know who they are and whether this fits consistently with their approach to Jewish law.
So it's not a matter of for or against. It's for opinion A or for opinion B, or even it could be for opinion C.
No. Well, so Julian's asking the votes are for A, B, or C. It could be, I'm not sure whether someone is allowed to vote twice or three times. I'm just, what?
Even if you can't, I mean, if there's 25 or 26 people
Yes.
on the committee,
Right.
12 could vote for opinion
Yeah,
A,
right.
and 6 could vote for opinion B.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. They could come down in a variety of fashions, and they could abstain for some reason. So yes, and so that the reason for the yes, no, or abstention is not given when the paper is published. We only know yay, nay, abstain, and who they are. Okay, so that's how the process works. A question, individual rabbis pose questions of the law committee, and there's a secretary to the law committee who is a rabbi or a rabbinical student whose job it is to answer the question. So they'll either refer the rabbi to a previous paper. All the papers are published on the Rabbinical Assembly website, so they're accessible to all. As a conservative rabbi, I have a password for the website, and so there's member content only on the site, but the decisions, these papers, are not member-only content. Anybody in the world can access them. It's helpful if one is not familiar enough with the language to have guidance in helping to understand what the paper is about, but they are accessible to everyone. So if there isn't a paper to refer to or a simple answer that a rabbi is asking, then it's up to the chairman of the law committee to decide whether the committee is going to address it. And if they are going to address it, then the committee, the chairperson, assigns someone from the committee to do the research and write the response. And it goes through a process of several readings where committee members make suggestions, raise questions, ask about what about this source? How come you didn't look at that source, etc. And then it goes through several editings. So it's interesting to see what the law committee has decided were important enough issues to work together as a committee. And we might be wondering, well, these three topics might not be necessarily topics that would have come to mind for the average conservative Jew as being, wow, these are important issues of the day. These will help determine the future of conservative Judaism and help bring more people into the fold, because look at the brilliant papers that are being published by the law committee. So those within the movement might find these interesting. Those outside of the movement might not find them interesting and might be scratching their head as to saying, what is the law committee dealing with that? So as opposed to 9 years ago when the law committee spent 2 years talking about the issue of homosexuality, that I would dare say would be something that everybody would agree was something forward-thinking on the conservative movement's part. And as a halachic movement, a movement committed to the system of Jewish law, it was quite radical compared to what the Orthodox movement and several Orthodox denominations were doing or not doing about homosexuality. So that is something. Whereas the topic for tonight and the next two sessions, sports and exercise on Shabbat, how to give a reference for school or job, and may non-Jews open the ark, well, that last topic might be an important one in terms of how welcoming a synagogue is to interfaith families. But the first two, it's unclear outside of a committed conservative laity how many people are really interested in these topics. But these are the three most recent decisions, actually within the past 2 years, that the law committee dealt with. There was a fourth one, which I didn't bother bringing up because I wonder myself why the law committee even dealt with it again, and that is women and the observance of mitzvot. So that already is a done deal. It was something that was done before I got to rabbinical school. So when I applied, when I entered rabbinical school in the fall of 1984, they had already discussed that and allowed women to be rabbis. So there's a whole volume on the ordination of women as rabbis, a paperback volume, based on papers that members of the law committee and faculty of Jewish Theological Seminary wrote, all dealing with the very issue of egalitarianism and the role of women in synagogue and observance of mitzvot. And it is Joel Roth's paper that is the one that I followed at the time when I became the rabbi of Shaare Tefila, and we adopted as a congregation egalitarian practice. And so that very lengthy paper is in that volume, and it's already dealt with. It's 30 years old already. Why they had to write a new one is beyond me, but okay. So that's what the law committee does. So they meet 4 times a year with a lot of work. So to be on the committee, you have to agree. Well, you have to be asked to be on the committee by the chairman, and you're either appointed by the seminary, or by the Rabbinical Assembly, or by United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. Those are each one of those organizations has a certain amount of seats on the law committee, and they are the ones to appoint. And then you have to agree to write a paper. So the paper could be 10 pages long, as we'll see non-Jews opening the ark, or it could be 80 pages long, which is tonight's paper, so you don't know what you're getting yourself into when you say, yes, I'll volunteer and write that one. Okay? So any questions about Any further questions about how that process works? Yes, Adriana. Yes. So the lay people, I think, are nominated by the by United Synagogue. So that's the organization of synagogues, conservative synagogues. So they are the ones that appoint the lay people. They don't write, but they have a right to vote. Okay. Yes.
When you joined Shaare, did they ask you about egalitarianism before you came in?
Yeah, so Julian's asking if the congregation asked me about egalitarianism before I came in, and the answer is yes. It was any candidate who was going to be interviewed by Shaare Tefila had to agree to had to be in favor of egalitarianism and would have to try to make the congregation egalitarian. That was a prerequisite. So yes, yes, and I know the other candidates who applied and who came for Shabbat, and all of them were pro-egalitarian. And it was easy to make the congregation egalitarian. It wasn't much of the congregation was ready at the time. We had a study session on Joel Roth's paper, and 6 months later we were fully egalitarian. So all things should be so easy in life as that. So, okay. So any other questions about the law committee? Okay. So I've attended one or two. I think any member of the Rabbinical Assembly is allowed to sit in on law committee meetings. They are an all-day affair at the seminary. So I might have gone once when I was in rabbinical school, haven't been back, and I haven't been asked to serve on a law committee, which is just as well. I have plenty of other work to do. Okay, so the topic tonight is written by an old friend of the family. His father, Jonathan Lubliner's father, may he rest in peace, was a classmate of my father's in rabbinical school, and I remember spending Shabbat and when I was 6, it was our first trip to Israel, and we stayed with the Lubliner family outside of Haifa. So I know Jonathan Lubliner from way back. He's a rabbi in Jacksonville, Florida now, the large conservative synagogue there. And so he wrote this very lengthy and detailed paper on sports and exercise on Shabbat. So before we get into the details of the paper, I just want to provide a little bit of background about what that means and why it's even it's a question for discussion. So the way Jewish law works is that we follow the system as set up and arranged by the rabbis 2,000 years ago. Okay, so in other words, we aren't Jewish just on what the Torah says. We're Jewish on what the Torah and the rabbis say. Okay, so that's a very important point. Because if we were just following the Torah, we would be called Israelites. But we're called Jews because of what the rabbis did and developed. Okay, so that's just a basic foundational point from which everything else about Judaism today derives. Okay, so that has everyone within the Jewish world agrees on that point, that everything we do Jewishly today is based on the Torah and the rabbi's interpretation of the Torah. Okay, so that is written Torah and oral Torah would be the two terms. Written Torah being the 5 books of Moses, and in some respects, depending on what the issue is or the topic is, on other books like the holiday of Purim. So that's not from the Torah, but it's from the Bible. So written Torah is 5 books of Moses and the Bible. And oral Torah is the rabbi's interpretation of that. So Orthodox believe that the oral Torah, the rabbinic interpretation, also was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Okay, so that's the distinction between the Orthodox and conservative. that the conservative movement does not believe that the oral Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Oral Torah written by rabbis, it is clearly human. So it allows, therefore, because it is a human invention, allows for more room for change and evolution. If you say that the whole system comes from God, then who are we as human beings to change the system? Who are we to change God's word? Okay, the more you think that human beings are involved in the process of the Torah, written and oral, the more there is room for change. Okay, but that's just a distinction between Orthodox and conservative. So when it comes to then observance, everything that we do today is therefore based on what it says in the Torah and what the rabbis say about what it says in the Torah. So, for example, Shabbat. Okay? What it says in the Torah about Shabbat, there's a lot in the Torah about Shabbat, but not many details. Very beginning, start of chapter 2 in the book of Genesis, is God rested on the seventh day. And forever, it's a day of rest, because God rested. Okay? Then you have the Ten Commandments. Well, you have another section before that, but there's the Ten Commandments, where observe the day of Shabbat as a day of rest. Do no manner of work on it. Nobody should do work on Shabbat. Okay, and then the building of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, there's a couple of places there in which we are reminded to observe Shabbat, okay, as a day of rest. And then we're told specifically, do not light a fire in your homes on Shabbat. And in the book of Numbers, there's a story of a man who was gathering sticks on Shabbat, and he was brought to Moses. What do we do with this guy who's gathering sticks on Shabbat? And Moses didn't know. He didn't know the answer. He had asked God what to do with the guy, and God said, stone him to death. Okay? So we know that Shabbat is supposed to be a day of rest. Do no manner of work. But what does that mean? Somebody's work is somebody else's fun. Right? So, I don't know, somebody doing surgery, that could be fun. Or for somebody else, oh my goodness, I would never want to do that or touch that. Right? Somebody working in a garden could be work or it could be fun. Okay? So, to help define what work is and to come up with a common definition of work, the rabbis defined for us 39 categories of work, based on the fact that we are told to observe Shabbat in the middle of the description in the Torah of the building of the Mishkan. So the rabbis then make the connection between the building of the tabernacle and Shabbat by saying all work involved in building the tabernacle are the categories of work that are forbidden on Shabbat. Okay? From those 39 categories, you have derivative categories. Okay? So that helps us then understand. So basically a collection of maybe a chapter's worth of sentences about the observance of Shabbat in the Torah becomes the longest section in rabbinic literature to talk about them and come up with all the laws for Shabbat. So the section on Shabbat in the Talmud is one of the longest, if not the longest section of any of the sections in the Talmud. Okay? So 120 or so pages that the Talmud devotes to understanding what it means to observe Shabbat. So all of it is about defining what work is and what we're supposed to be refraining from doing, and how, and then in the positive way, how we can observe it as a day of rest. And what that means too. What kind of rest are we supposed to be doing on Shabbat? Is it totally not doing anything? Is that how we're resting? Or is it a day devoted to spiritual activities? Okay? So, with that, any questions about that background? That's the background which we really needed in order to then delve into this paper. Okay, so that's the understanding. You have the broad category of do not work on Shabbat, which is then defined by the rabbis what the 39 categories of work are, which then have derivative subcategories to them, and that's Shabbat. Then the other issues, the other topics that Lubliner mentions as main categories in dealing with work on Shabbat, there is an understanding of carrying on Shabbat. So carrying is one of the works that's forbidden. Okay, so the question that the rabbis ask is it work? When does carrying become work? So for the rabbis, carrying becomes work when we are carrying outside of our home, when we are carrying in the public thoroughfare. In our house, carrying something in our house isn't necessarily work. It depends what we're carrying and why we're carrying it. But carrying a pot of food from the stove to the dining room table in our house is not carrying. Carrying that pot of stew outside of our house into our neighbor's house would be carrying. Okay? Because unless there's an eruv. Okay? So let me try to explain this without making it sound ridiculous and wondering why the rabbis are coming up with all these loopholes. So there are elements to observance of Shabbat that enhances Shabbat, right? There's a community element to Shabbat, right? The idea that we're supposed to go to shul on Shabbat, the service on Shabbat is longer than any other service during the week, so that we can spend more time focusing on spiritual matters that we might not have the head for or the time for during the week. And those prayers are best done in community, right? Reading from the Torah can only be done if there's a minyan. Some of the other prayers can only be recited if there's a minyan. So you need community. Community has to come together on Shabbat. And community, when you're at home, Shabbat is better enhanced when there are a lot of people around, right? Whether you have a lot of people in your family or you're inviting people over. Okay, so community is a major part of that. So how do you observe Shabbat with community when we're told that one of the ideas, and so when you observe Shabbat in community, you are, one of the things is to share a meal, and if you're sharing a meal, you're bringing something to the meal, usually, right? So that's part and parcel of what it means to be invited to dinner. You're going to bring something to the dinner. So how can you bring something to dinner if you're not allowed to carry? So the rabbis created 4 categories of property: public, private, and then 2 others which are one's called a Carmelite, and one is I forget the name of it already. I'll find it in a minute. Just a second. Because it's just, once there is an eruv, then you don't really need to know the categories of, there it is, makom patur. There's public, private, Carmelite, and makom patur. And it's part 2, section A on carrying in the paper explains those 4 different domains from which you can either carry or not allowed to carry from. So they come up with the different domains, and then the only way in which we are allowed to carry in the public thoroughfare, according to tradition, Mishnah, and Talmud, is if we build an eruv. So an eruv, in simple terms, is a fence around an area that makes that area into essentially private property. So that enables then a sense of community, that people can push a stroller with babies in them to shul on Shabbat, because pushing a stroller, though it doesn't make sense, is technically, according to the rabbis, carrying. Even though it's pushing a stroller, it is technically carrying, and so you can't do that on Shabbat unless there's an Eruv. Carrying your talus to shul. So some people would wear a talus. So if you're wearing something, you're not carrying it. It's part of clothing, right? But if you are, what about things in your pocket? Things in your pocket as carrying, even though it's in your clothing, it's carrying, and you're not supposed to have anything in your pocket unless there's an Eruv. Okay, that's simple. Anything else about Eruv becomes too complicated to get into tonight. But just so that we understand, for the issues of sports and exercise, we have to understand this issue of carrying on Shabbat. So in Olney, there is an Eruv. Our conservative synagogue and the other conservative synagogue is not in charge of that Eruv. The Orthodox synagogue is. Now, if you Google Eruv Olney, you'll find a map of the Eruv. And if you care about the Eruv, there's a phone number to call on Friday before Shabbat to find out if the Eruv is up. Because technically the Eruv has to be checked every Friday to ensure that it's all connected. And if a part of it is not connected, then the Eruv is down, and then people can't carry on Shabbat. Okay? Silver Spring has an Eruv, and you can go online to find that. So the Kemp Mill area has an Eruv. White Oak has an Eruv. Woodside has an Eruv. I believe Potomac has an Eruv, etc. So you'd have to go online, Google Potomac Eruv to find out exactly what the boundaries of the Eruv are, to be sure that you're living within it, and then to check to make sure that the Eruv is up every week. Yes, sir.
Are they all constructed and maintained by Orthodox?
Yes, all Eruvin, plural of Eruv, are built and maintained by an Orthodox community, whether it's a synagogue or a separate Eruv association. And it's very easy to do. The easiest thing to do to build an Eruv is utilize existing poles and wires that are already up. And most telephone wires above, obviously it has to be above ground. Most utility poles would count for that, but it has to be designated for an Eruv. In other words, you can't just say, poof, now it's an Eruv. You have to put something on the pole. So we all know when it's public property, whether it's the utility company or whether it's the municipality that owns the pole, you need a permit. And it's not so easy to get a permit to utilize that pole for an Eruv, because then it has to have a public hearing to allow for somebody to put something on a pole. And if there's a public hearing, then you have to explain what you're doing. And how do you explain what you're doing in a way that makes people say, oh, these Jews are smart people, right? It comes off kind of weird. And then it gets into taxes and the anti-Semitism that has happened in many communities across the country, where a simple request just to put a little piece of wood, because if you look carefully on some of the utility poles up Georgia Avenue, you'll see a little piece of wood attached to it. That means that it's an Eruv. It's part of the Eruv. So somehow the Orthodox shul here got the permission from Pepco or Verizon to do that. So in other communities, it's not so simple to do. You would think that the larger the Jewish community, the easier it is to get it done. But sometimes it's the Jews who are not part of the Orthodox community that make life hard for the Orthodox community and refuse to get it passed. And some see it as, who are these Orthodox? They're not sending their kids to public school. We don't want them here because we want our public schools to be better. And they're not sending their kids to public, et cetera, et cetera. So you can imagine the politics that gets involved in, like if the Hamptons on Long Island. It's taken them a long time. I don't know if they have an Eruv yet, but they've been fighting for years to get an Eruv. in the Hamptons. So you're saying your Barbara is shaking her head. No, I'm not so sure. They might have finally gotten one. No, you know for sure that there's not one in the Hamptons. There's a big Orthodox synagogue in the Hamptons.
There is the big Orthodox synagogue
Yeah.
here,
Yes.
and I pass it all the time. But there's not a neighbor.
Okay. So Barbara's saying that there's no Eruv there, and so yes. But if you Google that Eruv Hamptons, New York, you'll come up with articles that have been written about it and the struggles that they've that they've had in trying to get the Eruv built.
So it has to be a piece of wood that's put on that pole?
Something that designates the pole then as an Eruv, as opposed to just a utility wire. Okay? You can't just do, no. It has to be like a new thing added to it. I'm not up on all the laws of Eruv. So no, it's all right, but it has to be, you can't just put a spot of paint on it. And then that's defacing public property anyway. You can't do that. You have to have permission to do it. So, but a spot of paint isn't enough. You have to actually build an Eruv. Okay, so you can utilize something that's already there, but you have to do something to it to show that you've built it. Okay? There's a particular height that it has to be, particular material it has to be. I'm not up on all the laws of Eruv. Okay, so that is, the carrying is a major issue that's related to all the ideas of sports and exercise on Shabbat. Okay, so work on Shabbat is a major issue. And then the other sense is also the idea of celebrating Shabbat, Oneg Shabbat. So we think of an Oneg Shabbat as food that's served after Friday night services in synagogue. That's the Oneg. Oneg means delight. And so an Oneg Shabbat is feeling the delight of Shabbat. Okay, feeling the spiritual and happy feeling that we're supposed to have when we observe Shabbat. That is what Oneg Shabbat is, and Lubliner starts his paper by quoting the source in the prophet Isaiah from where we get the concept of Oneg Shabbat. Okay, so we have the idea that Shabbat is supposed to be a time of relaxation and enjoyment, Oneg Shabbat. We have the idea that we're supposed to not do any work on Shabbat. So then, now let me say it this way. Many people who have not been born and raised as an observant Jew, that is, born and raised observing Shabbat in a traditional way, might find it difficult in adopting these practices of observance, because they can be seen as restrictions on our lifestyle, as opposed to adding new things to do in our life in a positive way. Okay, so in other words, if you're thinking about all the things that you can't do on Shabbat, it makes it hard to think, oh, this is something I want to add in my life, all these negative behaviors, right, that I always have to be thinking what I can't do on Shabbat. So I want to be very careful in framing this in a positive way, okay? So that everything that we do on Shabbat has to reflect the idea that we are resting, that we are making Shabbat different than any other day of the week. I think that's the best way to put it. Shabbat has to be different. God designated the seventh day as a different day. It's a day that God did not work and do any creation. So it was a day that was different. So what we have to do then, as Jews, is make Shabbat different. So traditional Jews then, within the system of Jewish law, will make Shabbat different by refraining from doing any work and avoiding anything that they would do during the week. Any kind of work they do during the week, they would avoid on Shabbat. Something that it looks similar to work that we would do during the week that we can't do on Shabbat would be called Shavut, or uvdin dechol, as he refers to it as well, work of the weekday, or shavut, which is a rabbinic category, an expansion of these categories of work. Okay, so anything that smacks of work or something that is creative in a process would be forbidden on Shabbat. Okay, so for example, you can even, let's say, traditionally, you're not supposed to touch anything that you can't use on Shabbat. You can't touch it on Shabbat. So in other words, let's say I had a pen lying around. I can't touch a pen on Shabbat because I might be tempted to then use it. Okay, so the pen becomes muktzah. Okay, that's a category. Something that you are not allowed to use on Shabbat is muktzah. Tefillin, what we wear when we pray during the week, that's muktzah on Shabbat. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you can do work with. It's something that is associated with during the week that you're not supposed to use on Shabbat. That becomes muktzah. So if you have money in your pocket or money lying around, you can't be moving the money out of the way on Shabbat, touching it, because you might be tempted to use it in some fashion. Okay? So now, how does this all relate to this topic of sports and exercise on Shabbat? So, the idea that we want to observe Shabbat in a way that is relaxing, that is different than the weekday, something that is enjoyable. And many people find sports and exercise to be enjoyable. I personally don't find exercise to be enjoyable, but many people do. Okay, I have an elliptical machine at home. I am on it for 45 minutes every morning during the week. I would not consider doing that on Shabbat because that's not enjoyable to me. I do it because the doctor says I have to exercise. So I exercise, I get it done, and it's fine, and that's part of my routine now, my regular weekday routine, and so I either do it 5 or 6 days a week, sometimes on a Sunday, it depends, but never would I consider exercise on Shabbat. But there are other things, other sports you can play, theoretically, that you can do on Shabbat. So I went to Camp Ramah as a kid, and certainly I worked at Camp Ramah. That's the camping movement of the conservative movement. And that's a big deal to do on Shabbat, is to play sports. So it was always a question, every summer, a discussion with the campers, how you can play sports on Shabbat in a way that is in the spirit of Shabbat. Okay, so an element of sports, which makes it very attractive and like a number one cultural thing in America, is the competition with it, right? Well, now it's the gambling on it too, but there's the competition. You root for your team, you want your team to win, and you certainly want the other team to lose. So being from Philadelphia, I always want my teams to win, and I especially want them to beat the Washington teams, even though I've lived here for 21 years. Okay, so that's part of competition. So the question is, so is that competitive nature of sport appropriate for Shabbat? Okay, so there's an interesting statement in here in the paper that compares the concept of do not light a fire on Shabbat, that as a metaphorical term for do not be angry on Shabbat. So competition can lead to anger because if the sport isn't going, if the game isn't going your way, you can get angry at yourself for making a stupid move or being klutzy, or angry at your opponent. Okay, so you don't want to engender that kind of feeling on Shabbat. So, but you can play sports for fun. It is what a radical concept. Just be playing because it's fun to play baseball or football or any other sport on Shabbat. The only caveat is how you are playing the sport, where you are going to play the sport, how you are getting there to play the sport. Okay, so those issues are issues that are really the main issues of the paper. So the question isn't about whether you can play baseball on Shabbat. The question is how you're getting the baseball bat, the glove, and the ball to the playing field. How are you getting to the playing field as well? Okay? So the issue becomes the issues of carrying. Because if you happen to live next to a baseball field, then arguably it might not be carrying to the baseball field. Or maybe there's a cabinet at the baseball field where you can store equipment and then just open the cabinet on Shabbat, take the equipment out, and you can play. Or maybe it's something that's not considered. So if there's an eruv around the community and the baseball field and your home are both found in the eruv, then there's no issue of carrying, and that's okay. How are you keeping score? So if you're playing for fun, you shouldn't be keeping score, but I guess if you're playing, you have to keep track of strikes and balls and outs. So you have to do that. So you can't write it down because writing is forbidden on Shabbat. Somebody has to have memory to be able to keep track of the balls and strikes and the outs. Okay? So what? You can have a Shabbos goy, right? So yes, a Shabbos. The concept of a Shabbos goy is not exactly a politically friendly concept. Elvis Presley was a Shabbos goy in Memphis, Tennessee. Mario Cuomo was a Shabbos goy in Brooklyn or the Bronx, wherever he grew up. Colin Powell was a Shabbos goy also. So yes, so famous non-Jews served as Shabbos goys for their Jewish neighbors. So again, not a politically friendly concept, but the idea is that we can't do work on Shabbat. You're not supposed to ask somebody else to do work for you on Shabbat, but you can ask them before Shabbat to do it. So in other words, if you had forgotten to ask your non-Jewish neighbor to turn off the oven for you or to turn on the oven for you, you can't ask them on Shabbat, oh, I forgot to ask you. Can you do it? Nope. You can't do it, so you can't ask somebody else to do it. But you could possibly give a hint. You could say, boy, it's really cold in here. And just leave it at that. And maybe the person can say, oh, maybe I should turn on the heat. And I'll turn on the heat. But I can't ask, do you want me to turn on the heat? Because then you've just ruined it, because the Jew can't answer yes. Because if you answer yes, then you're indirectly asking them to turn on the heat for you. Okay? So the Shabbos goy so that's how synagogues function with janitors. You can't ask the janitor to do work on Shabbat, but you can give them a whole list of things that they're supposed to do for the whole week, and they know that this is what they're doing on Shabbat, and that's fine. Okay? So yes, it's still a loophole, but it's less of a loophole. Whatever. So all of Jewish law involves loopholes too, and then that's a whole different discussion whether that adds to the system or diminishes the system. This whole concept of loopholes. But so if there's an eruv around the community, you can carry equipment to play your game, but you want to play the game in a way that is not competitive. And he also says football should only be played as touch or flag football and not tackle football, because the whole idea of tackle football you need some kind of spirit in you that is not necessarily a Shabbos spirit to want to knock somebody over. Okay? But there's no stopping in an easy way when it's tackle football. Okay? So the potential for getting hurt is quite high. And touch football, you're stopping them too. You can push pretty hard in touch football, but it's not the same as tackle football. Okay? You need some kind of adrenaline to be able to do that, and that kind of adrenaline is not appropriate adrenaline for Shabbat. Yes?
Wouldn't the opposing lines offense and defense, be putting a lot of energy
So right, yeah. So yes, energy goes into actions in all sports, and Lubliner is saying that there is some value to that energy, that people enjoy expending energy in that way. It helps them by playing. Some people, when they play sports, really are just enjoy the physical endeavor. Again, it's not me. I'm not. I enjoy playing, but I don't play very well. I enjoy watching, and I enjoy expending physical energy, walking, hiking. So that would be fine, but it's the extent of the energy. So, in other words, if you're playing for fun and the whole idea is fun, then it's okay. It doesn't matter how much energy is going into it as long as it's fun. Once that fun becomes work, in other words, you're playing football for 5 hours instead of an hour, that's going overboard, and you're already sweating, and you're potentially creating more opportunities to hurt yourself. That already makes the endeavor from fun into work. Okay, so work then becomes an extended category, and then it's not fun anymore. But again, it's a subjective definition. People know when they're having fun, but there's a limit. So some people would have fun playing tackle football. Professional athletes might have fun playing tackle football, not on the field on a Sunday when they're not playing. So in other words, those who are just retired but are not too old yet might still like playing tackle football because they know how to do it, and they like the physical element of the sport, and that could be a lot of fun. But Lubliner says no, even for someone who would have fun playing tackle football, that there would be no anger in it at all. It's just a matter of enjoyment. That's too far. That the tackle is too far. Touch and flag is the limit to what we do. Okay, so that's just. He also talks about bicycling on Shabbat. So a friend of mine who I study with all the time does bike on Shabbat. This Rabbi Ethan Seidel will bike some places on Shabbat, and he has a different explanation for it than how Lubliner puts it. So riding a bicycle on Shabbat, there's the issue of traveling on Shabbat. One is not allowed to travel, okay? But there's a question about how far you're traveling with the bicycle, okay? And whether that is really, so can you ride your bike within the confines of the Eruv, but you're not allowed to go beyond the Eruv, because not only is it travel, that riding the bicycle itself is carrying. It's in an unusual kind of way, but you are on this equipment, but technically it's considered carrying. That's why pushing a stroller is also considered carrying. I can't explain it, but you're using equipment, you're taking equipment out, and even though you're not holding it in your hand like you're carrying it, you're pushing it, and so it is taking something that's not on your body that you're wearing, and therefore anything that you are holding and dealing with that you are not wearing is considered carrying, no matter whether you are physically carrying it or not. So pushing a stroller or riding a bicycle or riding a skateboard or something like that would be considered carrying. So for Lubliner, riding a bicycle on Shabbat would be forbidden unless it's in an Eruv because it's carrying. Okay, yes, Adriana.
And two questions about the Eruv.
Yes.
By reading this response, there was so many references to
Yes.
Eruv.
Yes.
And do you know any conservative synagogue that has an Eruv committee?
No, because see, wait, let me just stop you right there, Adriana, just for people who might be watching and didn't hear the question. Do I know of any conservative synagogue that has an Eruv committee? The answer is no, because it's the same with kashrut. Okay? Because if you want the Eruv to be recognized, the Orthodox won't recognize something that the conservative movement does. Right? So what would be the point in having a conservative Eruv? unless there's no other Orthodox synagogue around. So let's say you're in Montana and you're a conservative synagogue and there's no Orthodox synagogue there and you want to build an Eruv, then yes, it makes sense to have a conservative Eruv then. But if you're in a metropolitan Jewish community where there are all denominations, there won't be a conservative Eruv committee because the Orthodox have the Eruv committee.
All right, then by extension, how come there's no talk about Eruvin around?
So how come there's no talk about Eruvin around? Well, it depends on the rabbi. Okay, so I have to admit, full disclosure here, I'm not really into the concept of Eruv, and my concept of carrying is a little bit different than Lubliner's and the traditional idea of carrying. Because carrying, the traditional concept of carrying is that even a key, something so light that's in your pocket, is considered carrying. Or carrying an umbrella in the rain. That's two things. You're carrying and you're also building a temporary shelter when you open the umbrella. Okay, so there are categories then that are defined in a way that I personally don't agree with. I wouldn't go so far to say it's ridiculous. I would just say that I just have a different definition of them today, and I don't consider it carrying in a way that is considered work. So, because I think it's okay to carry on Shabbat, that's why I haven't made a big deal in our congregation about the Eruv and made sure that that I'm a stickler for the literalist thing of being carried, not carried in. And I would say that most conservative rabbis in the Washington area are the same as I am. I would say that Rabbi Lyle Fishman or Kodesh and Rabbi Stephen Susan at Har Zion would be the only conservative rabbis who care about Eruv in the way that's described here. Everybody else has a more liberal approach to what it means to carry on Shabbat.
So that's good. Then I found the piece a little bit out of touch.
Exactly, which is what I was alluding to in my introduction. So Adriana's saying this paper is a little bit out of touch. And I totally agree with that because I think most conservative Jews would go, huh? Basically, that would be the first reaction to reading this paper. What does this have to do with my life? I am an observant Jew. The average conservative synagogue, the average person who goes to shul on Shabbat on a regular basis, okay? The average person who goes to shul on Shabbat here at Shaare Tefila, everyone except for two people drive to synagogue on Shabbat. Okay? I would say out of all those people that drive to synagogue on Shabbat, and I'm not casting aspersions or anything like that, just talking factually, you're driving someplace else on Shabbat too. 8 times out of 10. Maybe you're going to somebody's house afterwards. Or maybe you're going, I don't know, maybe you're going to Starbucks before you come to shul or after shul. I don't know, but I'm saying that that's probably the case for most people who are driving to synagogue on Shabbat. Okay? So it's some congregations have more people who walk to synagogue on Shabbat, but it's the rare conservative synagogue that has more than 1 million of people who are walking to synagogue on Shabbat. So that's not a good thing or bad thing about the conservative movement. That's just the reality. So if most people are driving to synagogue on Shabbat, you're already, according to Lubliner's point of view, would be you're not allowed to drive to synagogue on Shabbat. He doesn't buy into the minority opinion that says that people can. If he's upholding Eruv, as he is in his paper, he's upholding that you can't drive to synagogue on Shabbat. Because what does driving to synagogue entail? You're turning on a fire. Again, I'm not saying good or bad, just saying, technically speaking, you're turning on a fire when you turn on your car. Unless you have a Tesla or some other all-electric vehicle, not a hybrid, because a hybrid does turn on the engine also, uses fire too. Talk about a Nissan Leaf, or the BMW has an all-electric car, and Tesla. So that, maybe you can play with it. All electric, There are some who say using electricity on Shabbat's okay. But then again, you're traveling. So you're technically you're carrying when you're driving your car. According to Lubliner's definition of carrying, you're carrying when you're driving your car. So you have to understand, carrying does not mean the Webster's definition of carrying. Carrying Jewishly means holding on to something that you are not wearing on Shabbat. So when you hold on to the steering wheel of your car, you're carrying your car. Even though it's carrying you, according to the English language, according to Jewish law, you are carrying your car. So you're carrying your car, you're turning on a fire, and there's other electronic stuff that comes on in your car when you turn on the car too, right? If you turned off the car with the radio still on, when you turn on the car on Shabbat, the radio comes on. Whoa, that's a violation also, because if you don't use electricity on Shabbat, if you don't use electricity on Shabbat, maybe you're not driving on Shabbat. So anyway, so that's all these things, all these compromises that we are doing. Right? So, but wait, David. So just back to Adriana's point. So then the average conservative Jew looks at this 80-page paper that Lubliner wrote and says, what does this have to do with my life? Okay? Because it's not helping me in any way. How is this enhancing my observance of Shabbat? How is it helping me understand, oh yes, this is what I want to do differently on Shabbat now to make Shabbat a better experience for me? No, this is making it worse. I would argue that this is making it worse. Really? You're telling me that I can't play baseball on Shabbat unless there's an Eruv? Come on. I'm carrying a baseball bat. Who cares? I'll wear the glove. Okay? But, so maybe I'll wear the glove walking with. I'll carry the glove. How is that considered carrying? That's ridiculous. I want to have fun with my kids. Okay, so maybe I can understand not doing competition. That's a lesson that you can teach people, that Shabbat should be different in that way. We shouldn't be competitive on Shabbat. That's something certainly, but this, come on. So yes, so it's not a critique of Lubliner, and if he's ever going to watch this, I know, Jonathan, I love you. You're great, but I'm just saying, as part of the conservative movement as a whole, that some of the papers that the law committee publishes, you wonder, who are they writing them for? And is the average conservative Jew going to change his or her life by reading this paper? So unfortunately, I think the answer is no. Okay? So, like, some of the issues relating with kashrut, there is a paper a number of years ago about pizza. And so, can you eat pizza out? Okay, there's a whole question about eating dairy out. There's another question for the conservative movement. So there you're dealing with reality. How do you make kashrut a part of your life in a way that it can be meaningful and relevant? So my father's a conservative rabbi. I grew up eating hot dairy food out in non-certified kosher restaurants. That it's clear that that's a compromise. Because really, there should be a lot of questions that should be asked if you do that, which we don't ask. And you have to really ask that food has to be prepared in a certain way in order for it to really be considered kosher. And you have to make some compromises, too, about cheese and other things like that. So you make all these compromises, and then you wonder how many compromises you're making until you realize that maybe what I'm eating is not really kosher. Okay, so when the conservative movement deals with the kashrut stuff, they're really, by writing these papers in which all these questions have to be asked in the pizza parlor, and how there should be one of the many shelves in the pizza oven should be designated as as the non-meat pizza shelf. How realistic is that really? And then there's the essence of the meat that gets in the oven, and then the essence goes onto the pizza too. So you have a cheese pizza that has the essence of pepperoni in it. So yes, all these things are saying, wow, I'm not going to eat pizza anymore. So are you really enhancing people's lives by telling them how bad they are? right? Because you want to really you want to welcome people into the movement and say, these are things that you want to try to do to enhance your life. Maybe someday you might want to increase your observance, change your observance, etc. So I'm just saying these are important questions to ask, and sometimes they're not answered in a way that makes conservative Judaism seem to be as welcoming as necessarily as Reform Judaism is. Right? So the Reform movement today that passed a resolution, I think, at their annual convention about transgender people and being more open to transgender people. They're way ahead of the curve of everybody else within the Jewish community. We think as conservative Jews that we're way out there when it comes to homosexuality, but that was only 9 years ago. Okay? There have been homosexual people more than just 9 years ago. So why did it take that long to do it? So again, the people on the committee, though many of them are very open and welcoming rabbis in their congregations, when it comes to the law committee, it becomes very narrow, and it seems as if we're back in rabbinical school again in the ivory tower instead of recognizing who we're really talking to. So David, what did you want to? Okay, go ahead, Bill.
So how does this pertain to me?
Right.
Am I making my own decisions?
Right. So here's guidance, Bill. So I'll use you since you brought up yourself. How does this pertain to me? So you like to ride a bike, and you like to hike. Okay. So you might want to think about riding a bike on Shabbat. You might want to ride a bike to shul instead of driving to synagogue. Maybe that would be a way to enhance Shabbat experience. So that way, yeah, if we care about the carrying part of it, then you're only violating carrying on Shabbat as opposed to lighting a fire on Shabbat by driving to synagogue. So you're a pretty good biker. You do what? You could do 50 miles on a bike without sweating, okay? Okay, maybe 20, 30 without sweating. So you can make it from home to shul on Shabbat if it's nice weather. So that could be a way to think about it. Okay, maybe I'll ride my bike to shul instead of, but then you can't come with your uncle or your girlfriend. So that might defeat the purpose of then getting to shul. But okay, or hiking on Shabbat. So it depends whether one is, not you specifically, Bill, whether one naturally perspires easily or it takes some exertion in order to perspire. So how much hiking are you going to do on Shabbat? And what equipment are you bringing with you on Shabbat? Okay, so if you're hiking in a place without an eruv, which most mountains are, they don't have an eruv around them, then you're supposed to be doing like a day hike. Maybe you compromise by putting some stuff like a granola bar in your pocket and a bottle of water in another pocket. So that technically is carrying, but at least it's in your clothing, as opposed to wearing a backpack. So that limits how far you're going to go. But that again it's all a matter of thinking about what am I going to do bicycle riding or hiking today on Shabbat that's going to be different than what I do during the week, and how can I enhance my Shabbat by doing something that I enjoy as well. Okay, that's what you're supposed to think about. Marv.
I'm going back about 35 years now.
Yes.
Rabbi Rabinowitz of Abbas Israel
Yes.
gave an impassioned lecture and speech and sermon on the fact of what you can do. His thesis was if you spend your entire week in an office,
Right.
working, reading, doing everything like that, your rest is maybe something else.
Right.
Is there a problem with that? Well, the Orthodox, my sister was sitting back of me, almost had fit.
Right.
And his whole thrust was
Make the day different.
Make the day different.
Yes.
In this. So instead of basically talking about everything you can't do,
Right.
what can you do?
What can you do? So Rabbi Rabinowitz, may rest in peace, great rabbi, leader of the conservative movement, but not halachic necessarily, not traditionally halachic. Okay? Right. I'm just saying, so if you're saying, the spirit is the same, you want to make the day different. And you want to focus on oneg Shabbat, on the delight of Shabbat. But he was encouraging people,
Every single day.
right? You don't want to be in surgery all on Shabbat, absolutely. But to encourage people to play golf, what? Unless it's an emergency, right? Because pikuach nefesh, absolutely, to save a life overrides Shabbat. But to encourage people to play golf, playing golf, first of all, you got to pay to play golf, unless you're a member of a golf club. Okay, so maybe, but then you still have to make the reservation for the tee time, right? So, what? Or tennis? Well, that too. You have to make a reservation. But you see, there's work involved in planning to play tennis or golf, especially with golf. Golf, you can't just, well, I guess you could just drive up to a public golf course, but you can't play by yourself. I don't think you're allowed to play by yourself, even on a public course. You have to wait until one other person shows up, 3 other people show up, or they force you to become a part of a foursome, right? Then how are you keeping score? Okay, so somebody else writes down your score for you. Okay, who's carrying your golf clubs? Right, and he talks about that too, the divot. Right, what of all the things to talk about carrying your golf clubs or driving a golf cart. Now, the golf cart's electric. Okay, I don't think there are any gas-powered golf carts. So, what, there are? There are, oh my goodness. Okay, well, I think most of them are electric though. So, all right, so let's say you use electricity on Shabbat, okay? So I'm saying it, I'm answering the Rabinowitz golf thing through a traditional lens. And you see the problem with it.
It's something different. If you want
Right, I know, but I'm just saying to evaluate Rabinowitz's statement through this traditional lens, you could see how that's not what to do. How about going to a museum, which in Washington you can do for free? You can just walk in. So that definitely you can do on Shabbat. Okay, but let's say you're visiting from out of town and you're in a hotel near the mall. You can go to museums on Shabbat. That's not a problem. Not a problem. That makes your day different, and that's free, and that's not a problem at all. But are you carrying a backpack getting into the museum on Shabbat? So, all right. So some of the things to think about are maybe beyond us. It's beyond me because carrying is not an issue for me, but I do limit what I do carry on Shabbat. I wouldn't schlep all this stuff on Shabbat. When my wife and I go on vacation, we like to hike on Shabbat. So if we like to stay in a place that is accessible to a hiking trail. And so whereas during the week we would have a big backpack we pack our lunches in it and other stuff in it. We won't do that on Shabbat, and we'll walk these trails in a leisurely fashion. But I don't worry about an Eruv. I don't worry about an Eruv. So those people who do worry about an Eruv, it's a problem. Going on vacation on Shabbat is a problem, and that you can't always go on vacation in a place where there's a shul. Right? So it limits where you go in the world. Right? So do you want to be limited in that way? Like, how could you ever climb Mount Everest? You can't do that if you're Shabbos observant. It takes more than a week to get up Mount Everest. Right? Doesn't it? I think you could rest up there, but then you're taking your life in your hands if you're resting up there. Right? You got your Sherpa carrying your stuff for you, so there's your Shabbos goy as the Sherpa. Right? But where's shul? Unless you're climbing with a minion. And then you're climbing with the Torah too, so you're reading Torah now. So you see how ridiculous this gets. Now in Kathmandu, there's Chabad. Okay, but that's way below Mount Everest. That's at the foothills of Mount Everest. It's your base camp there. You could do that. One of the largest Passover Seders in the world happens in Kathmandu. So, really, yes. And I know somebody who's been to it. Now, she didn't climb Mount Everest, but she went to Kathmandu. Anyway, so you can see how difficult it will be to be Orthodox Shabbos observant and see places in the world. Right? How do you go to Japan? I mean, Tokyo has a shul, but it's one shul where it's both conservative and Orthodox at the same time in the synagogue. There's only one shul in Tokyo. Okay, so what do? How do you eat when you go on vacation? So people bring their own food with them. Not every place, though, that you're traveling to will let you bring food with you. So these are questions that are raised, not just from this paper, but just in general. How to be observant? What does it mean to be observant? How do we add observance to our life in a way that makes sense to us and enhances? Observance should always enhance. It should not detract from our observance. If we're always thinking about the loophole, then that's not what we're supposed to be thinking. What we think about observance is how it enhances our life. All right. That's, unless anybody else has
I
a...
have
Yes.
a question that's a little bit off. But so how do the rabbis, how do they deal with the clergy? In other words, are you sharing with us on Shabbat?
What do you mean?
You're really working on Shabbat.
Oh, right. I am technically working on Shabbat. It's part of my job description. Right. So, yeah, how do we get around that? I'm not sure. Because rabbis have worked on Shabbat since they were rabbis. They gave a sermon on Shabbat. So they didn't think that was working. They thought that was... But then they weren't necessarily paid. In the time of the rabbis, Mishnah and Talmud, rabbis weren't paid. But from the Middle Ages, well, let's say in the shtetl, you had itinerant rabbis. They were paid for giving lectures on Shabbat. How do they get around it? It's a good question. I don't know. I really don't know how you get around it. I think it's just a matter of being part of Shabbos observance, and a rabbi is paid for everything the rabbi does, including speaking on Shabbat and running the service. Yeah. All right. Have a